And it is, as we prepare for our annual January ice storm.
Right.
And this is Writer's Voices with Monica and Caroline. I'm your host, Monica Hadley, and with me is my co-host and mother, Caroline Kilborn.
Good afternoon, everyone.
So, Mom, who do we have on Writer's Voices today?
Well, today we have a gentleman, Marc Nieson, and he's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and NYU Film School. His background includes children's theater, cattle chores, okay, and a season with a one-ring circus. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? He's been awarded a Raymond Carver Short Story Award and 2 Pushcart Prize nominations. He serves on the faculty of Chatham University and is a fiction editor at The Fourth River. And this is a most interesting book. Most interesting.
Today is Schoolhouse, Lessons on Love and Landscape by Marc Nieson. Welcome to Writer's Voices, Marc.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Monica and Caroline.
Schoolhouse is actually set a little way up the road from here, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it used to be. It's not there anymore, but it used to be about 15 miles west of Iowa City.
Oh, so what happened? What happened to it?
Well, the building itself was raised about, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago now.
Uh-huh.
And but the land that the schoolhouse was on was about 350 acres of woodland and pasture, and that's still there, very strong, and it's a state park now. It's called Redbird State Park.
Ah.
When's the last time you were there?
Well, I'm really lucky. I get to go. I mean, I'm not living in the Iowa area anymore. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania these days. But each summer I come in for the Iowa Summer Writing Festival, and at some point while I'm there, I make it a point to get out to the land again and just walk it. And I mean, I know it really, really well, and I'm always walking it in my head, but it's nice to do it with my feet once in a while too.
Yes, indeed.
So tell us about what brought you to the Iowa City area, which really is what this book is about.
Yeah, well, initially what brought me there was having learned about the Iowa Writers Workshop. When I first came, the first summer I had come there, this was back in, let's say, 1991, so we're going 26-odd years ago, with that Summer Writing Festival, which I had heard about, and I signed up to take a class, and I'd never done anything like that before in my life, and I was very taken by, just sitting in a room full of people that I didn't have to sort of apologize for who I was or what I was trying to do, and folks that were trying to do the same kinds of things I was, and I was hooked, and then I was lucky enough to I applied for the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I was lucky enough to be admitted into it, and coming out to the Midwest, completely changed my life. I was, a New York City boy, and coming out to a rural landscape was something I was extremely intrigued by, and almost from the moment I arrived there, I was like, I need to live out in the corn. I need to live out there, and I was able to find a place. This what was an old one-room schoolhouse from the very early 1900s, and surrounded by all this amazing sort of woodlands, and I did it, and that's where I went and I changed. And the schoolhouse for me was a place that, maybe it was interesting that at the same time I was going to a master's program in learning how to write, I was also living in this what had once been an elementary school and learning fundamental lessons that I'd never had the opportunity, just having come from a more urban area.
Well, you couldn't have found a better place because Iowa timber woods is magnificent. It really is.
My gosh, yeah. It's a landscape that's just it's imprinted itself on me.
Yes, yeah. I could tell that by your story, and it was interesting. The way you wrote narrative, and then you wrote in there some of your journaling, which was interesting. I thought the way you laid the book out, I thought was quite interesting.
As I mentioned, this is from a 25-year ago period of time when this is. I look at a year basically when I was living at the schoolhouse, and I structured the book around an academic year so that it starts in the fall and comes around to the fall again, And, part of what I was learning was the things that I was writing about day to day as I was interacting with the woodlands and the local, flora and fauna. And so it seemed like it made a lot of sense for me to include a certain part of the journal in the book as well. Also, from a writing standpoint, it allowed me so much license in terms of how to structure a narrative. I could hop in and out of narration and go to journal entries and then let the white space in between them create its own kind of juxtaposition and ultimately a invitation for the reader to be co-constructing the story alongside with me as they figure out how they fill in the blanks in between the two things that I was sort of having them read as the text.
Mark, had you always journaled, or was this something that you just started when you were doing the master's program?
I had not always done that. I came to writing late. I was actually 30, 31, 32 when I started the program at the university, and I hadn't had the regimen or the awareness of journaling. I think a few years prior to coming to Iowa, I'd lived in Italy, and I think that's where I first started to do any kind of journal writing. And then when I came out to the Schoolhouse, it just seemed absolutely natural for me to be writing in a journal. And I got one, those old sort of Mead speckled composition books.
Yes.
And it was like, oh, this is, I'm a young kid again in a way, learning. And so putting the entries in those books felt really natural. So it wasn't so much a part of the MFA program as it was an attempt to try and learn something within the walls of the elementary schoolhouse.
So how did you end up in Italy in the first place?
Well, that's another story. I think one of the parts that we haven't talked about in the book thus far, it's also not only is it sort of this, white New York City boy trying to find himself in the woods. Part of it is also I was on the lam, if you could call it that, from a long-term love affair that sort of needed to end, and I didn't know how to do that.
Uh-huh.
And I had tried leaving that relationship once before, and I had traveled across the ocean to do that. And Venice was a place I had visited for less than a day earlier than that, and knew it was a spot I wanted to live. It was just like you stepped into a maze and a merry-go-round all at once. And so I'd gone there also to get away from New York to an extent, and also to try and, at that point, I was trying to see what it would be like to live around the world in different places. And Venice was the first place I picked, and it was just so right. I stopped wandering. I just stayed there for two to 3 years. I was there altogether.
It's interesting because when I've been in Venice, I just was there once, but I always thought of it as a place that nobody actually lived.
Yeah, well, it can feel like that because there's obviously a huge part of the city, even more than when I was there, in the late '80s, is overrun by tourism, and so because of the maze kind of network of the back alleys of the way in which the city is constructed, it's very easy. Not necessarily, you could be what would be a half a block away from where you're standing and have no idea what's in that area and have no way of knowing how to get access to it. The tourists, to a certain extent, stay within a certain given area, but there are some areas of Venice which are still very popular in the sense of having the original populace. They're getting smaller and smaller, obviously.
Yeah.
But there's 2 or 3 areas in particular that I think remain with a lot of the flavor of what has been there for centuries. But I ended up living in areas that were sort of middle ground. But there's a lot of residencies in Venice.
I guess I assumed that it would be.
You have to spend some time in a place and learn the language and learn the map, if you will, and then you get to see some of the secrets or maybe not secrets isn't a good word, but you get to see some of what's familiar there and what feels.
The history of the place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And real life. I think part of it is I assumed that it was so expensive to live there that it would be hard for an average working person.
Yeah, well, that's why most of the people haven't, the majority of the Venetians have moved to the mainland, have been pushed out by what ends up being speculation. I would say probably, I can't say a percentage, but I wouldn't doubt it's 20 to 30% of Venice, if not more, is owned by foreign folk that don't necessarily ever live there. So they come there only 1 or 2 months a year, and the rest of the year it's closed down.
What amazes me is
they ended up living there very cheaply, strangely enough.
What amazes me is Venice itself, all the buildings that are surrounded by water, and I don't see how they could endure all these centuries. I mean, it just boggles my mind.
Yeah, well, they're trying, and the beauty of it is it's not even on land. I mean, this is created land. It's pilings that were pounded into the lagoon floor, and it is amazing.
It is.
It's an architectural and engineering as well as aesthetic, wonder, frankly.
Yeah.
Well, going from Venice as your first escape to Iowa as your second, I guess shows that you're a man who likes to mix things up a bit.
Yeah. But you also make it sound like there's a lot of conscious thought that goes into it. I think I was just bouncing, if I think about it from that period of time. I wasn't sure what I was doing in terms of vocation or anything. I just, looking back on it, I can see that there's some sort of pattern to it, sure. I like to travel. I like to be, and more than travel, to actually be able to live in other places for a certain amount of time, so that you could really, really feel that you're acculturating also to an extent.
Well, I think people who live here in Iowa or in the Midwest will appreciate your perspective as an outsider, that you can sometimes see the beauty that we overlook because it's so familiar to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is that, and I think I think that's because I stopped. I think you're right. It's because I stopped and I
you left
settled there for a little bit of time. But most of the people, certainly I wasn't telling anybody on the East Coast how great it was. We were trying to keep them out of there.
Right, there you go.
I was a little greedy, sort of, in my way, but no, it's like anything. How much do you take something for granted because you see it every day, or how much do you not see what's there because you're speeding by at 70 miles an hour? That's it's always, and that's the hugest lesson of what I think the Schoolhouse time did for me, is it taught me what intimacy is. In terms of living on a piece of land and figuring out how you belong, and being aware of the solar power, as you called it, of how the pond warms up and how long it took for things to melt come spring, and all of those things. And then there was the intimacy of learning that the romance of isolating yourself, like a Thoreau Walden, has its value, but ultimately, the intimacy is, we're herding animals on some basic biological level, or at least social animals, and being alone isn't our natural way, and I just had to learn how to be intimate with someone else, and that's what the time there really taught me. The hard-earned lessons, I'd have to say. Looking back, the guy in the book sounds a little whiny to me when I think about it, but he was young and he just didn't know.
Well, there's a blurb in the book that's on the back, too, that I think people will appreciate. Someone once told me that school and life were different. In school, they give you the lessons before the test. In life, it's the other way around.
Yeah, we pulled that one out for a reason, because I think it really sums up a great deal about what the book does, and ultimately I think what any of us, we all have lessons that we have to learn about love and belonging, and I think that quote sort of says that. I think, in that respect, I think even though for any reader, I think the book can speak to them. It's not necessarily whether they're in the Midwest or a marginal nature. I mean, all of us have this this need to sort of figure those things out.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. And our guest today is Marc Nieson, author of Schoolhouse, Lessons on Love and Landscape. It's published by Ice Cube Press, which is one of our favorite small presses.
Because it's in Iowa.
It is. And you obviously show a lot of appreciation for your publisher as well.
Oh, my God, I can't tell you. I'll scream his name out right now, Steve Semkin. An amazing individual. And like I said, I had started writing this book. I started writing it while I was still living at the schoolhouse. So over 20 years ago, I started writing it, and I shelved it for different reasons. And then I can talk about why it felt like it was time to bring it out again. But I had always envisioned this as needing to come out of Iowa and needing to come out from an Iowa publisher. And Steve was, I found him. And he was it. It was just like, this is the match.
This was meant to be.
So, yes, why did you decide now, after 25 years, that it was time?
I think for a couple of reasons. I think one of them, you mentioned in the beginning, we talked about the schoolhouse being razed. And so I recognized that I had that treasure of living in that building, that envelope, whatever you want to call it. It was a seed, really, if you want to think about it, for me. And I felt that though the building wasn't standing there anymore, that I was walking around feeling that all the time and knowing what I had. And then I said, well, other people should have that. I shouldn't have that just to myself. So part of it was that, trying to pay homage to what the building was. And the other part of it, I think, came, when I had drafted it, parts of the book in the 90s, some of me was thinking that, well, this is, sort of my own little belly button lint, and what does this story have to say to other people? And and I put it on a shelf also to be able to actually arrive at a place emotionally to write it better, or write it more honestly. But then it sort of started to occur to me when, we got into the new millennium and everyone was sort of operating on cell phones and internet and Facebook and having all these ways of being connected. I suddenly realized that the time I had spent there to isolate oneself, it was sort of, even though it was only 20-odd years ago, it felt like it was an archived kind of state of being. And so I suddenly was like, wow, this, for people growing up today, the whole idea of being able to be disconnected, to isolate yourself, is sort of harder. It's really hard to do now. So I was suddenly thinking that maybe the piece it had something to say about a period of time that was already passing. And in that sense, I thought that, maybe the book can talk to a new generation as well.
The history of one-room schoolhouses, I mean, a lot of people don't have any idea what they were. Right. But that was 8 grades in one school building, one teacher. That teacher had to be amazing to be able to do that.
Yeah, they had to. But also, I think part of what was happening was I think there was a more communal sense to how the teaching had to work also, because you had all those grades together. You had younger students with older students, and the younger students would be listening to what was going on the other side of the room with the older students.
Yeah,
and
right.
The older students, I think they took more of an active role of being, young mentors or teachers themselves. And so there was, obviously it required an amazing amount of ability by the teacher in residence, but I think that there was something that it worked as a gestalt was going on in that kind of type of a schoolroom setting.
Yeah, and like you say, it was a community. That school was a community, and they all helped one another.
Yeah,
that's what a community is supposed to do, right?
Right.
Now, Marc, you said that you came out to one of the summer writing classes, which don't have any real prerequisites. It's basically if you sign up and pay your money, you can come. But the Writers Workshop Master's Program that you were in is a completely different story. Did you have any idea how, like, what an honor it is to actually even get accepted into that?
I don't think I knew it when I was applying. I mean, when I came out, like I said, I was so dumb. I thought that the Summer Writing Festival was the Writers Workshop. I had just read about it in some newspaper or magazine, and so I was confused. But I went upstairs to talk to the people there, and they were very kind at the time. Connie Brothers, who's still there, I went up and talked with her, and she said, "Well, you know, yes, this is what the Iowa Writers Workshop program is," and she was very kind to also hand me a listing of all the other MFA programs around the country, because she knew it was very competitive.
Right.
And my first instinct, like you say, I'm interested in different regions and different types of ecosystems, and so I ended up thinking, well, maybe I'll go to the Southwest and be in a desert, or maybe I'll go to the Northwest and be more in mountains, and I started looking at who was teaching in those programs, and a lot of them had come out of Iowa.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, it all started there. You know, that was
Exactly.
the first program,
Exactly.
almost close to 80 years ago now.
Oh,
But
gosh.
so then I said, well, maybe there's something about the source here, and I should try. And I was lucky to get in. And actually, I couldn't even go the first time I got admitted. There was other stuff going on in my family life, and I actually couldn't. I asked if I could
Defer?
defer. Right. I asked if I could defer, and they said, well, you really can't, because they base it on the here's the handful of submissions that come in, or applications that come in, and we're basing it on how do you rate next to those. So they said you have to apply again.
Ah, wow.
They said probably there's a good chance you'll get past the first cut, but we can't guarantee. And so I actually got in twice, I guess you could say. So in that sense, I was listening to the message that was saying, you should come here. This is where you should come.
What kind of writing had you been doing previously to this, and had you published at all?
No, I hadn't published anything at all. I had the first. My background prior to this was in more filmmaking, and filmmaking led me to script writing, and so I guess you could say I had done some. I collaborated with a friend who's a director, and we co-wrote scripts. So in that sense, I guess the work went public. Some of my writing went public, but as far as prose was concerned, and that's what I think I learned in the process of going to film school, is that I actually liked that medium wasn't my best medium. Doing all that collaboration with a bunch of people, I did much better sitting alone in a room. And so then I sort of then started working in prose, and I think I really started to try and make that work when I was living in Italy. And again, that was my late 20s by then. I don't. I think all of the creative work I've done has been just variations on a theme. As a young child, I was a visual artist. That was where my leanings were. And so they're all just different forms of expressions. It just happens to be this medium. But I think at most what I was writing, I had started to write when I was in Italy, were what I would call short stories. And those were the pieces that I had submitted to the Writers' Workshop to try and get accepted. So that's as much as I had really started at that point.
And what kind of work did you how did the workshop change your writing? Let's put it that way. Did it change the type of things you were writing about, or
I think it's in various different ways. I mean, I think there's the argument going back and forth about whether this is something that can be taught anyway. One of the largest things I would say, at least for me, was finding that community, finding other people that were trying to do the same thing. I think the question of whether your writing gets better is really a question of whether you put in the time at the desk. Obviously, you have to have a certain amount of nascent, leanings towards this, or talent, whatever you want to call it initially. But it's the tenacity that's going to make you a better writer. But being exposed to certain teachers there, and I think for the first of my life, recognizing, wow, this is something that I could this is something I could do with my life. That in Iowa, city and in Iowa as a state, writing is something that is really respected. And so there was that component, I think, that I saw it as something that was actually viable. And then I think what changed me most, I would say, within the program had to do with my interactions with James Allen McPherson as a teacher and a mentor. And he just passed away this past year, and I actually dedicate the book to him. He had a huge effect on me, and not so much in terms of the craft and of putting together sentences, but more importantly about seeing your work as being in the context of a time and a period and a place, and what is it that you have to say to the world. And how is writing also, what component of it has a civic responsibility.
Now, Marc, we've heard over the years a lot about how, particularly in the early years at the Writers' Workshop, the workshopping of a piece could get pretty. The criticism could be pretty cruel at times.
Well, I think that's something you hear because that may be how it's received by some people. I think different professors have different philosophies of how to teach and different tonalities of how they might teach. The intent always, of course, is to try and help people get better. Some of that may have to do with what the expectations are of the individual when they go into the room. But the other part is just the plain thing about, you're putting up work which is very vulnerable. You're putting up work that's not finished yet. You're just learning your lessons. And so, yeah, if you're vulnerable, and if certainly if you don't have a good hold on what your ego is, that could be problematic for some people. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'd actually watched some people get hurt creatively, but I don't think that's the intention of what a workshop does. I don't think that's where it comes from. If you look at, even the etymologies of these things, a workshop is about, in the dictionary it talks about, it's about a problem solving. And so I think there's, at least this is my take on it, I think it's all about positive. And taking whoever, as a teacher, let's say, put it that way. I see my task as bringing a writer from wherever they are at this juncture to the next plateau. And it's not about pushing them down the hill.
Well, I think a lot of times writers, or some writers they'll be so in love with what they've written, and they take it in there thinking everybody is going to think it's the best thing ever, and it's going to be a bestseller, and they get they can't handle if that's not the reaction that they get.
Yeah, well, and again, that just speaks to a certain youngness, let's say, or a certain naivete in terms of being able to read your own work yet, and being, the workshop is perfect because you have a dozen people to give you input, and eventually you don't need a dozen people. You need maybe 3 who are good readers for you, or then you need one person who's a mentor, and then eventually you have enough distance from your own work or objectivity on it that you can see it from apart. But no, and even at this point, no matter where you are on the writer, you finish writing and it's midnight and you're ready to call Nobel. Then you wake up in the morning a little more sober and you look at it and it's like, oh no, I have to. There's more work that needs to be done on this, and I think that's maybe one of the biggest things that a workshop will teach you is that it's a drafting process. It's about doing sketch after sketch after sketch, and somehow, I think in visual arts we understand that, and somehow because all of us can write, we think that it should be done or done quicker. But it's a craft like any other one that you have to make a practice.
Now, Marc, with all the hundreds of writers that we've talked to in the 10 years we've been doing this show, there seem to be 2 main schools of thought in terms of kind of work style, where the one is that first drafts you write as quickly as possible. You don't do any editing. You just pour it out on the page, and then you go back and work things over as many times as needed. And the other one is that you craft each sentence, each paragraph, each page as you go.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, probably the numbers pan out that way, that there's sort of like half-half in terms of how people process.
So which one are you?
For me, I'm a very slow writer. I don't think I just take a long time to do things and think about things, and I'm slow at most things in my life. That's one of the things that talks about in the book, in Schoolhouse, is that, I was very myopic as a child, and I'm very slow in terms of picking up on things. But I think also maybe some of the tools that we use now to do our writing are changing the way in which people are writing. The whole idea of even knowing what is your first draft anymore is hard because people keep tinkering on things because you can on a computer.
True.
But I think probably there are some. I think there is those who write quickly and those who write slowly. I think there seems to be a certain obviously
a divide
on the spectrum there.
Yeah. And do you think that the fact that we can edit so effortlessly, in terms of the logistics of editing now with word processing and computers compared to, typing, handwriting a manuscript, typing it up, crossing things out, editing, having it retyped, and how tedious that was. Do you think that has made the end product better or worse?
I think probably neither. Long run, ultimately, you're going to make your, the thing that the public is ultimately seeing is the thing that's finished and polished. How it got to that state is a whole other question. But I do think though that people are getting into the editing or mindset or even copy editing mindset a lot sooner than they did historically, and I think that does affect something in people's process or how they think things should proceed. There's a great value of being able to type, do something handwritten and then typewrite it up and have it come back to you in another form, and then to look at that. So at least I can say that in my process. I think the gene pool is probably shifting now as the writers that are coming up have all started on
computers. Yeah.
Of how you read anything is not scanning left to right anymore. People have a much different form, and you're seeing that effect in the forms of how people are telling stories. There's far more multi-narratives that are going on. That's just that's a shift in the culture, and the attention span too, maybe.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. Our guest today is Marc Nieson, author of Schoolhouse, Lessons on Love and Landscape. Marc, why don't you read a section from the book so our listeners can get an idea of the flavor of your writing?
Okay, great. That would be a delight. Actually, I think what I'll do is I'll read a snippet. The book's it doesn't really have a table of contents. It has what's called a lesson plan, and that just seemed organic to the subject matter. But each chapter is, it could be named after things you'd find in elementary school, subjects like geography or civics or spelling, anatomy, social studies. What I did on my summer vacation, things like that. And I think I'll read a little piece that comes out of history, since we were talking about how listeners may or may not know much about the schoolhouses. And I'll start with maybe a little snippet of a journal entry, so you'll get a feel for how that works in that. Okay.
All right.
5 December. Drove over to Kelowna's grocery this afternoon for bulk grains and sorghum. The Amish had turned out their cattle to graze on corn stubble, taking advantage of the melt. Their laundry is out again, too. Drab dresses, dish towels, corsets. Down the road, children's boots on the stoop outside their schoolhouse. I pulled over to watch dismissal, the kids walking the muddied roads beneath their wide-brimmed hats and bonnets, their books in arm. Stole a peek in the window. One room like mine, yet crowded with desks. A squat brown wood stove in one corner, and a whole wall of blackboards scrawled with arithmetic and Bible verses, erasures. And at the time I went back to the schoolhouse and was thinking about where would the blackboards been in my schoolhouse? So then I go to I'll skip now to a spot where I go to it was actually the Iowa Historical Society, to the library there. And with the help of a librarian, I was led to a topographical map of Johnson County, dated 1900, and divided into its 20 townships. I ran my fingers over the map's grid west of Iowa City until I found a road that looked like Black Diamond. At the time, it was dubbed Old Man's Creek Road, and the road followed the creek, and the creek branched to the north amid a cluster of ridges and trees, just like it did at Redbird's Farm's edge today. That point on the map was nestled in the southwest corner of what was then called Union Township. From there, I went to the microfilms, scanning county superintendent records. It felt like I was a detective in a novel, rummaging through dusty files and shelves for clues. One roll referenced teachers' annual reports, and so I asked the librarian. "Oh, we got the original of those," she said, "back over here." We walked to the rear of the library where she climbed a stepladder toward a high shelf. "Well, how far back do you want?" "I don't know," I said, "as far back as you've got." One by one, she pulled down 5 cumbersome ledgers and laid them out on a wooden table. Each was tied with twine and bound in faded soft leather. A few of their corners had worn through, raw threads of cloth peeking out. Carefully, I slid the most recent book toward me and undid the brown knot. And lifting its cover, I almost expected moths to float up into the air. What I found instead were yellowed pages, hundreds of them. I flipped to the section marked Union Township and then back through the years until in 1956 I found a name I recognized, Jim Walters, a local birdwatcher I knew. Age listed him as 8 years old then, and his sister Julie at age 10. And off to the right was their mother's signature, Paige Walters. 13 students were listed on the roster for that year, ranging from ages 5 to 13. And the preceding page recorded their teacher's signature and the school's heading. My school had a name after all, Union Number 9. Near the bottom of the page was a space for suggestions concerning supplies, and the teacher, perhaps not knowing yet that 1956 would be Union Number 9's last year of classes, wrote, "I'd like to see 4 to 6 new chairs to fit the height of a recitation table, a hectograph, some cement or gravel around the door, and less mice." I continued paging backwards, checking the Walters kids' attendance through previous years until their names disappeared into other names, the records sifting back through the Second World War, the Depression, and World War I. And with each successive ledger, the schoolmarm's calligraphy grew more flowery, their names murmuring like music, Isla Wade and Dorothy Driscoll, Luella and Consolata, Daisy and Grace. Meanwhile, the pages themselves became more and more brittle, separating from bindings, fading, crumbling. And then in 1911, all the names gave out. I turned the page forward again. January 8th, 1912. Union Number 9 is born into history. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the day. January the 8th, the dead of winter. It must have been below 0, even without wind chill. And leaning into that wind comes Anna Rarrett, the new teacher, arriving at the schoolhouse past dawn to start a fire and haul water from the creek for the children's basin. She sets down the bowl and the bucket, pauses, then reaches for the broom. Though she'd come and anxiously swept the floor the last evening, she does so again. So many mice droppings. She sits and stokes the stove, quietly watching her breath in the air, trying to melt the snow from her skirt bottoms. She's thinking about her forenoon lessons, thinking about what she'll do with her $42 pay come the end of the month. At 8:50, she glimpses Maynard and Hazel Thomas trudging their way up the road, all bundled up and holding hands, their mittens a bright red against the snow. She jumps up and writes her name clearly on the blackboard, steps back, then adds Miss and the date. When the children finish kicking their boots against the stoop, she shows them into the cloakroom and where to set their dinner pails. At 5 minutes past 9, her other 2 students, the Halstead children, they still haven't arrived. She glances out the window one last time and decides to begin She clears her throat and says, "All right, children, this is your new Jones reader. Now turn to page..." "Excuse me. Hello?" said the librarian. "Huh? It's closing time." "Oh, I'm sorry," I said. "I must have drifted off." I returned the ledgers to their top shelves, then slowly drove home in darkness. By the time I rounded the last bend toward the schoolhouse, flurries were falling in the cast of headlights. Once inside, I hung my coat on a hook and turned up the thermostat. Too cold now for the fireplace alone. I pulled over a chair near the floor grating and I warmed my toes. And the floor joists creaked with the heat and the wind outside pressing against the walls. I'll stop there.
And that was Marc Nieson reading from Schoolhouse, Lessons on Love and Landscape. Now, Marc, whenever you write memoir, anyone who writes memoir, you have to deal with the fact that you're writing about real people who may still be in your life or may not. Now, you know.
Did I deal with that?
Yeah. How did you deal with that? How were, like, the woman that you were, the relationship you were trying to end?
Right.
Does she, you know, how did she react to this book, or are you still in touch, or do you know, or?
I don't know. The last we were in touch was in 2001. Again, she was living in New York City, and it was soon after 9/11 that I just felt I needed to make contact. She had children that lived down near that area, and so that was the reason why I got in touch. But how she's going to react to this book, I don't know. I don't know. I did tell you, I don't even know. She may not even be alive now. It's possible, but my guess is that she is. She's the one person in the book that I actually didn't sort of check with, and that you know, maybe that's again me not fully being emotionally ready to deal with that, or I don't know. I just had a feeling that I think I do her honor in the book. I don't think that there's any dishonor that's done to that. But pretty much so everyone else that's in the book I've sort of checked with. You know, I wrote the sections and I asked them, you know, can you live with this? And because I didn't want to change names.
Right.
You know, yes, in memoir there is a certain amount of fabrication, obviously. You know, I mean, in that scene that I read, you know, I was fabricating a scene of what it might have been like at the schoolhouse that morning. You know, I have no real sense of that. And even if I am writing about actual conversations or scenes where I was interacting with other people, you know, you have to approximate dialogue. I think any reader sort of understands that when they're reading. You know, nobody had a
recorder going.
but for the most part, you know, you are bound by trying to make something as factual / truthful as you can.
And of course, you can't write dialogue exactly the way it was spoken anyway, because it would
can't.
be too boring.
Everybody understands that. Nobody expects differently.
Right.
But I do think that, you know, if you are publishing something and calling it nonfiction or creative nonfiction or memoir, you know, there's a certain amount of ethics involved here, and sometimes even what you think is going to be problematic is not. You know, I mean, part of the book I'm writing is about some, you know, you can call them skeletons in the closet, or certain things that weren't spoken about within my family, and you know, actually part of the reason why I did write them is because I think secrets and denials about the past doesn't necessarily help people. And it turned out, in truth, you know, some of the people like that in my family, you know, they found this really useful, and we've been able to have conversations since that we never could have had prior. So that design of some of that fear is a fear of how somebody's going to react, and a lot of that has to do with privacy and disclosure more than it has to do with whether something is factual or truthful, I think.
Yes, definitely.
We don't always remember things as they really were, do we?
Yeah, well, the point is also, I mean, Frank Conroy was another teacher I had at the workshop, and though he was only teaching fiction, he once said, you know, because he has written a memoir, he said, you know, I'm writing you're writing your book. You know, it is not going to be the exact thing that somebody else experienced because they didn't experience it as you, and they can write their own book if they like. Everybody's. I mean, you and I, the three of us, can talk about what's happened over the last 20 minutes over this conversation. We'll have at least three versions.
Absolutely. You know, I had one a writer talk about. She wrote a memoir about Hope Edelman, whom you probably know from the Writers' Workshop.
Yeah, I know
taught up there.
Yeah.
And so she wrote about, you know, losing her mother at a very young age, and in the first book she was talking about showing it to her father, and you know, being a little concerned because there were, you know, aspects of his parenting that maybe weren't as a single dad after that maybe, you know, didn't sound that great. But the only thing he disagreed with was some very specific detail about a fur coat that her mother had had. That was the only thing he wanted her to change.
Yeah, and that's it. What people get hung up on, you know, and then maybe it was the fact of the color of it or the make of it. Who knows? But
yeah.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Broke off there for a sec.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and you can't predict that as a writer how someone is going to react, and you have to get over some of those fears yourself. You know, are you willing to go somewhere? And that's part of the vulnerability of writing. I don't put it this way. I don't think I treat anyone. I think I treat myself far harder than anyone else in the book. That's in the book, and that's part of the deal of writing memoir is being willing to be vulnerable.
Yeah, you show yourself naked, really.
Yeah. Or you show, at least hopefully you're showing that there's been some kind of trajectory in your life, and you got from there to now, or then, you know, there to here, or then to now, and hopefully there's been some movement there of some sort.
Now, Mark, are you teaching at the Iowa Summer Writing Festival this year?
This summer I am, actually. Yes. Yeah, I am.
And
I'm going to teach a couple of weekend classes and one. I'm actually teaching a week-long course on memoirs. So, and I end up calling it Self and Society. And there's the actual point of it. You know, how do you not just make it about yourself, but find something communal?
And what are your weekend courses that you're teaching?
The weekend courses, I think I'm teaching one weekend that is on process and progress, which looks at not just, you know, a lot of the focus goes on what you write, but not necessarily on how you write. So we look a lot about how our process works, and you know, frankly, if you can't get to the desk, you're never going to write anyway. So we look at that specifically, and how, you know, there's times you write well and times you don't write well, and how do you figure out which are the times that you write well and recreate that for yourself more consistently. The other weekend class I'm teaching, I think I'm doing a new one this year that's about thinking about place as how place is a character, how you know, you're right, you know, place-based writing, which is the majority. That's sort of the core of what we teach at the MFA program that I teach at in Pittsburgh at Chatham University.
I was interested to read the part where you talk about how you noticed that the integration of the timber, the woods, and the atmosphere is with writing. How they go together.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, you ask any little kid, and you put two things together, they'll come up with a story. You know, so that links the two of them. So that your imagination can make a metaphor out of anything. Mm-hmm. But it is, you know, I think finding the ones that feel apt and at least truthful. And I think, yeah, part of it, as I was saying, I was at the same time I was learning those lessons at Schoolhouse, I was learning how to write. And so I think I was seeing that in the landscape as well, and learning how to read a landscape and how to see patterns. And it's not all unlike how do you see how words create patterns on a page.
Well, speaking of metaphors, I just wanted to read one of my favorite metaphors from your book. It's on page 95, where you're talking about owls. Mm-hmm. And you write, they seemed to the dark sky what sharks were to deep water. Mm. That one struck me as very...
It's from the point of view of a rodent.
Right.
No, I love owls too, because there's something that you they're a bird that you know they're there, but you rarely actually see them head on. It's just always sort of out of the corner of your eye.
Yeah, well, owls become an important bird in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I was very taken by owls.
Yeah.
And I noticed too that when I think you hit a coon at one point, and it subsequently died, and you felt really bad. You took it to the side of the road and laid it down, and you imagined that there were two of them, and the one was able to get away, and you noticed that one that had gotten away was probably watching you, and you could feel that. Yeah.
I also wanted to mention that there was one person that you write about in your book. I don't know if he was in the workshop with you or was teaching. I can't remember, but it was somebody whose name I recognized, whose work I'd read, and who I actually thought I saw once at Prairie Lights when I was in Iowa City. And that was...
Was it Chris?
It was Chris, yes.
Chris character?
Yes.
Chris Offutt.
Chris Offutt, yep.
Yeah. When I came to Iowa, he had finished the program already, but I got to meet him, and he helped a lot with first introducing me to the woods, and I actually acknowledge him in the book for he had talked to someone else who had been in the schoolhouse prior to me, and told them that this is probably the guy who should move in there, and so I owe a lot to Chris, as well as writing lessons too from him, frankly. But I learned what the woods could be. In many respects, from early woods walks I took with him.
Now, is he still writing?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
He's writing. He's down in Oxford, Mississippi now.
Okay.
And for a number of years, he went out west and was doing some writing for television. But he recently, this past year, he published another memoir about his father. He had a very interesting father who was a professional. I guess you could call it. He calls it my father the pornographer. His father wrote books, and some of them were pornography, and a lot of them were in that vein of
erotica.
Yeah, erotica. I guess that's the way. But he was a very imaginative one, from what I understand, and a very, very prolific one.
Oh, that's interesting.
He managed to do it in all kinds of different genres as well. But that's a whole other story about he and his clearing out his father's home.
Mm.
Yeah, you say here that the most precious the most precious value of any heirloom is its story, and I never thought about that, but that's exactly true.
Yeah, well, you drive down the roads and somebody's having a garage sale, and at some point all this stuff turns into it's in cardboard boxes, 2 for $1, and you walking up to it, you don't know what the real value of it isn't the thing, it's the story behind it, or the things that are attached to the object.
Yeah, that got me thinking.
Those are mostly, again, it's the story plus the emotion.
Right. It got me thinking about all the stuff that my kids are going to have to go through.
Oh, boy. Yeah. Well, you did it for your mother, and the problem is that we kept a lot of it.
Yeah, right. Well, there was a lot of value. There's a lot of valuable things.
I know. But,
and the value in history, because my great-grandfather was a judge in Iowa, and my grandfather was in Jasper County.
Uh-huh.
Central Iowa, around Newton.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So.
And we have a lot of correspondence from him, in the late 1800s between he and his brother who had moved out to Montana, was it?
Mm-hmm.
And also among other members of the family, a lot of correspondence from a soldier in the Civil War writing to his sister who was married to the judge or something. Anyway, one of the, I get mixed up with the, who was married to who and the family and so forth, but a lot of letters and postcards and even scrapbooks.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
No, I know. Yeah.
Pull them out and look at them.
Yeah. So I want to ask one last question about the classes you're teaching this summer at the festival. Do you still have openings, do you know, if our listeners are interested?
I believe so. My guess is that as far as I know, Amy Margolis, who is the queen of the festival, I think they are just actually putting out the catalog at this juncture.
I've already gotten an email about it, so...
Oh, did you? Okay,
yeah,
so then that may be that registrations have started to open, so I would, have people telephone or look it up online.
Right, because it's class size limited to 12, I think.
A lot of writers are, they put things off, so they may not get away. But I'd be happy to have somebody in a class if they come on down. So, sure, look it up.
Well, Mom and I have
look up
both.
All the others, so many talented educators at that festival.
We've both been there.
Mm-hmm.
I've gone at least 5 times, I think, over the years.
Okay, so I don't have to tell you anything.
But the problem is that when I go, I'm inspired. I think I'm going to write, and then I don't do anything until the next time I go. So that's
why when you get now you
yeah.
just have to. There's other people in the class, right?
Right.
So you just have to share each other's names and emails and. That it is the challenge. How do you sustain the that sense of camaraderie
the enthusiasm
and energy and that is indeed that is the truth. It's hard to write.
Yeah.
I mean, we think it's easy, but it's one of the hardest things.
Yep.
Well, I don't know if it's the hard, but it's hard to sit alone in a room. Who was it? Pascal talked about that.
Well, Marc,
years ago, if not longer, that's one of the hardest things, and it's getting harder. Getting harder to be able to sit alone in a room.
Well, in the 20 seconds we have left, what's your next writing project, Marc?
The next writing project is I'm working on a novel now that's called Houdini's Heirs, as in like when you inherit something.
Ah.
And it's set in Coney Island in a sideshow, and Houdini is in it too. He makes a couple of cameo appearances, but it's a modern day sideshow, and
that's
I
right.
guess I could call it call it a sideshow romance for now.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us. Marc Nieson, author of Schoolhouse, Lessons on Love and Landscape. If you're listening on Friday, stay tuned now for Planet Earth. And, Mom, do you have some final words of wisdom?
I do, about those teachers in the one-room school. The world seldom notices who the teachers are, but civilization depends on what they do and what they say.
Thank you for being with us.
Oh, Monica, Caroline, thank you. This was a lovely conversation. And I look forward to bumping into you at the Summer Writing Festival.
I hope so.
You too. Come up and say hey.
Okay.